Okay. Again, for those that came later, I'm Randy May, president of the Free State Foundation, and welcome back. I mean, look around. I bet so many of you haven't seen so many of your friends in a long, long time, right? Some of you that are with us each year, and there are a lot of you here in that category, know that almost every year I say, wow, I can't believe it's the 8th or the 10th or the 14th Free State Foundation Annual Conference. I can see Lynn Stanton nodding her head because she's heard me say that, but this year, coming out of the pandemic, it's really wow with an exclamation point, really, and so good to have you with us. So we're going to get started in a moment. I just wanted, so I don't forget, point out that as you know, we're going to serve one of our sumptuous buffet lunches. I said earlier that Laurie couldn't be with us today, but she did have a part in arranging the buffet lunch, and it's going to happen around 12:15, right behind that panel, which will be removed then. Again, welcome to if you're joining us late, welcome again to our C-SPAN audience. We're always pleased to have C-SPAN with us and thank them for that. Now, don't forget to tweet the hashtag FSFCONF14, so tweet away. This panel session really is titled The Hottest Topics in Communications and Internet Policy. That's about as creative as I could get, but we are going to talk about, I think, the most important, or at least some of the most important topics today in communications policy. I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm just going to say a few words about each one. You've got the brochure. You can find more words about their background in the brochure. You could, even if you wish, Google them and probably find out a lot more. But I want to mention a couple things that I think are important to me. And I'll just go down alphabetically and do that. First, we have Meredith Baker. Meredith joined CTIA, the Wireless Association, as its president and CEO in June 2014. I didn't realize it had been that long.
Crazy, right?
You probably, some days I bet you think it's been much longer than that, and other days you can't believe it hasn't been. But so Meredith, of course, served as an FCC commissioner before she assumed that job, as well as acting administrator of NCTA, where she played an important role, I think maybe the most important role, in overseeing the digital television transition. It worked so well that many of us forget about it, but at the time, there was a lot written about it. I see Dick Wiley in the audience, and he knows all about the complexities of the DTV transition. The other thing I'm just going to add about Meredith is that she probably remembers that she gave her maiden speech after she became an FCC commissioner at the Free State Foundation, which involved flying back from South America in time to get here. So I'll always be appreciative of that, Meredith. Next, well, alphabetically, that would be Chris Lewis, but I'm going to save him for last. If I say I'm saving the best for last, that I might get in trouble, but I'm going to save Chris for last and go to Michael Powell. Michael Powell is president and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. As most of you know, Michael served as chairman, a commissioner first, and then chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And I want to, this may be a sort of a setup to some of the discussion that we might have, but this is my one bit about Michael Powell, since I'm going back in history a bit for each of you. Michael Powell gave what I think is one of the most important speeches delivered on communications and internet policy back in December 2000. Michael, I know you know what I'm talking about. That was the great digital broadband migration speech. And that was shortly before Michael became chairman of the FCC. I'm just going to read an excerpt because it's the type of thing that I think is a backdrop to some of the things that we might be talking about. You can see I save things like this. That's what you do in a think tank. Michael said then that convergence is not just a technological phenomenon. Given the technical underpinnings, we see the collapsing of previously distinct markets and competitors. Convergence is radically altering economic assumptions and underlying cost structures. It is changing the game of capital formation and altering business models. The culmination of these changes is what I am referring to as the broadband digital migration. The challenge for us is to make a similar leap from analog-rooted regulations to ones that are applicable and relevant to the digital environment. Again, that was December 2000. Okay, Jonathan Spalter is up next. Jonathan is President and CEO of the USTelecom, the Broadband Association. Now, if you've been paying attention to these introductions carefully, you've noticed that after each one of these acronyms, CTIA, NCTA, USTelecom, there's been a dash, the Wireless Association, so forth, the Broadband Association. You've noticed a pattern here, so I bet Chris is I want you to figure out what comes after the public
It's the
knowledge
great brand migration.
It's just interesting to me. It made me think a lot about branding and what goes into it. Okay, with that, Jonathan, is president of USTelecom. He's been in that role since January 2017. An interesting thing that I didn't know about John until I refocused on his bio is that he served in the Clinton administration and was confirmed by the Senate as Associate Director of the United States Information Agency, USIA, and managed the agency's global technology resources. And to me, I know that remains an important position. But it made me think to be in a position like that, it's sort of a diplomatic, at least quasi-diplomatic position. And to be honest with you, I haven't had the pleasure of knowing John as long as I've known everyone else on this panel. But one thing that I learned very quickly about Jonathan Spalter is what a pleasant person he is to deal with and how polite he is, and I've appreciated that relationship. Now, Chris Lewis here.
You're scaring me, Randy.
I'm really, well, let me do the formal thing first. Chris is president and CEO of Public Knowledge, no dash after that, no hyphen. He's been president since 2019, I think, was with Public Knowledge before that. And one thing, I may have mentioned this before, but, and I'm not sure it's on Chris's bio this time, but he's plays an important role and has played a role in local politics over in Alexandria, and I think with the schools and other things. And I think that's important. But the most important thing I want to say about Chris really is that I appreciate him being here because I know that his views on some of the things that we're going to talk about today and some of the things that we focus on and write about and research at the Free State Foundation are different than our views. And frankly, I said earlier, for those that weren't here when I did the welcome this morning, that at the Free State Foundation we have our principles. They're free market-oriented principles, rule of law principles, and pro-property rights principles. But it's always been important to me to have a diversity of views presented at our events, and I always try and do that. I was pleased that Minion Clyburn was here, the earlier panel, and I'm very pleased that Chris is here with us, and that's always going to be important to us at the Free State Foundation. And boy, I think it needs to be important to a lot of other people, really, not only in Washington but around the country. And we're going to keep trying to espouse that philosophy. So, hope you didn't mind indulging me in that, but that's important to us. Thanks. Here. So now we're gonna dig in. We're going to talk about some of the same topics that those of you that were here listening to the commissioners talk about, but obviously they have a perspective from their unique perches, and these folks have their own perspective. So I think we're going to start off with what I think is the hottest topic in today in communications policy, and that relates, I'm going to put it all under the rubric of broadband deployment and adoption. And, you know, there's a lot that falls under, under that rubric. And I know everyone here is in favor of increasing broadband deployment, increasing adoption. I think, at least I think that's so. If I'm wrong about it, you'll tell me about it, but I'm going to assume that that's true. So what I want to do really to get our conversation started is to say we know that there's a whole bunch of money, you know, a boatload of money. I can't keep track of it all. I was never that good at math, but there's a lot of money that's being appropriated to support and subsidize broadband deployment and adoption to some extent. And, you know, we're familiar with these different programs, and, you know, they have their own unique acronyms. The BEAD program, you know, American Rescue Plan, CCP is one, SLFRF, state and local fiscal recovery funds. You know, some of these were parts of COVID bills, but there's all of this money that's being appropriated. So I want to ask our panel, and you know, initially we'll just go down the line here, to talk about what you tell us where you think things stand now, what's going to occur and should occur in the months ahead with these broadband programs, what the positives are or the negatives associated with them, or another way of thinking about it would be maybe I know Michael Powell in a speech a week ago, I think, when he was talking about this subject, I think you used the term implementation risk with these programs. And so I have in mind, and I'm not going to say much more about it, but I'm talking about things like, overlap among agencies that are involved. I'm talking about whether the programs favor one technology over another technology, things like that. So I'm going to start with Meredith, if I might, and we'll just go down the line. And one of the things, I'll say this right up front, I'm going to make sure, because of what I said earlier about the diversity of opinion here, Chris, I'm going to make sure that you have time, if there are differences, that you are able to respond. Okay. Meredith.
Okay, well, thanks, Randy. And I would echo his thoughts on how great it is to be here. I am a social creature, as you know, and it has been really hard to be quarantined and isolated, so it's great to see all of you, and you all look terrific. The question you ask is really broad, Randy. That's kind of like all 27 of the questions you gave us in one. So
no, it's only under the broadband topic, though.
I think I'd just start off in saying that these big grants, as you mentioned, my scars from the digital television transition still exist. These big programs are really, really hard, and Congress's mission, which is to let all Americans have broadband, is a really bold one. I think it's critical. We've seen that this is a national priority, and I'm glad that they are funding it. I think that they should. I don't know that taxes on telephones should actually necessarily fund all this anymore, since we know that it is a national priority. So I'm glad that we're looking at it. I think BEAD is a real challenge. I had lunch with Alan, and I was like, good luck, buddy, but you got to walk and chew gum, because we got a lot to do here. And he's going to get it right. He's the right leader at the right time there. I would say what we need is everyone on this stage and everyone on this room. I mean, this is a really important thing that we have, once in a lifetime to settle, and we need wired, we need wireless, we need it all, and we need to all work together. I think the solutions are going to be different for all the different communities, and I guess I would also just put in a plug too. From all the work that the FCC has done and all of us have done in the past few years in getting mid-band spectrum into the market, 5G home broadband is now the fastest growing broadband, and it is fast, and it is future-proof, and it is really affordable, and really bringing competition to this market too. So it's pretty exciting. We're at a really exciting time, and I'm glad that we've got this focus on broadband and making sure, I think during COVID, all of us stepped up, and all of us saw how connecting kids was really important, and we did it. And we need to make sure that we connect all Americans. So we're pledging to roll up our sleeves and work with everybody. We just want to make sure wireless is included in all of it as an option.
Well, while you've got your sleeves rolled up, just to follow up, and then we're going to, are you concerned, there was a period early on when the administration and some of the documents that it released, I guess the broadband plan, where it seemed to favor fiber as a technology over wireless. I think that was the position that wasn't even so subtle initially. Just tell me your thoughts about how concerned you are about any tilt in that direction right now, or have your concerns been assuaged, or what do you want to say about it?
I really do. I think that this is not a fiber versus cable versus wireless. I think this is an all of the above solution. I think that as long as we are giving states the option, then they're going to be able to look at their state and see what the right solution is for their communities.
Okay. Chris.
First of all, thanks for inviting me, Randy. I always appreciate the invite, and I always accept it because of the way you approach bringing different ideas together. I actually got my start on the digital television transition as well, and 12, 13 years ago, however long that was, and I think a lot of the lessons from what eventually was a success of that transition, some of them are similar to what we saw with all of the money that's been doled out that you talked about, Randy. So the positives, the things that were successful in both, is that The programs and the dollars that we're putting out right now for broadband largely came about through consensus building between industry, public interest, and policymakers. Jonathan, your members, and your guys' members of your trade associations, we were in constant contact with them about what needed to be done to get people connected, and I think that's a real positive. We saw the same thing with the DTV transition, where industry and government, public interest, local government worked together to make sure folks got their converter boxes, they were educated on what the transition was. This is a hallmark of good policymaking. So those are some of the real positives. The things that concern me are that in the long run, we have to do better at approaching and dealing with big picture problems before they're emergencies. Happened in my mind, in both DTV and in this instance. We've talked about the digital divide for how long, Chairman?
Forever.
Forever. And then until all of a sudden we're all at home and our kids are doing school online, all of a sudden it's an emergency. So that's a failure of us as policymakers and influencers of policymakers, in my mind. And we should all take the blame and the credit for how we responded, but also not getting ahead of the problem. How do we get ahead of the problem? By remembering the values that are constant when it comes to communications. I need to read that speech that was cited, because I want to see what values you were citing then, because I think there are consistent values that need to be preserved as technology transitions and innovates and advances. Some of those include the importance of universal service and universal access to technology. That's at the essence of the digital divide. But there are many reasons for digital divides, from costs to the consumer, to the cost of deployment in rural areas. We've thrown a lot of money at this problem in an emergency situation. Now we need to take the effort to create a long-term structure and system so that we are dealing with all of the values that come with trying to get everyone connected to broadband. And that means long-term solutions on affordability. That means long-term solutions on standards. You mentioned not picking one technology over the other. I don't care what technology we use to connect people, but I do care that it meets a certain quality level, that it meets a certain reliability level. These are the sorts of things we should be talking about as we set up laws, as we set up, regulations, because people assume they will work until they don't work, and we found out in 2020 that what we had as a structure of laws and regulations was not getting the job done. And thank you all for stepping up as industry players. The government shouldn't have to come hat in hand and say, please agree to this pledge to get everyone connected. We should be working together on that as a society in our laws and policies and regulations that we set up.
Michael?
Yeah, I think the exigency of the pandemic created a galvanization of political will that's often difficult to attain without a sense of crisis, to produce an amount of money at the scale necessary to make a serious impact on the problem. I mean, in fairness, the problem has been identified and been invested in for decades. We spend many, many billions annually on this problem. It's just a reflection of how uneconomic and how complex it is to serve the most remote parts of our country. That problem is very nasty, and I've always supported a major public investment to help close those gaps. But in that exigency also came haste. And haste results in a lot of complexity and novelty that I think is going to be the biggest challenge, not for the next year, but for many, many, many years. And that is problems associated with implementation risk. If I were to say it succinctly, it's a heck of a lot of money going to a heck of a lot of different agencies with a heck of a lot of different rules and requirements, all being done with some novelty, which I think is worth emphasizing. So it's more money than we've ever been accustomed to. We're not utilizing the regulatory agencies who are expert at this. We made a decision not to give this program to the FCC to give it to the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department, who are great, but their level of depth of experience, not to mention staff and resources for this problem, are much more minimal. We made a decision because of the exigency, the sense of urgency, to give grants to states. Well, that's 50 different jurisdictional operations, some who are very experienced at these types of programs and will probably do a great job, and some who have no idea. And we'll be getting $100 million minimum, no matter what, and we'll have to figure out how to do that thoughtfully. And by the way, without real clear, coordinated oversight at any level you can easily identify. So there's massive coordination problems. There's massive oversight problems. There's massive ambiguity around rigor associated with the statute and the rules. Again, that's not, I sort of celebrate the effort, but I am very concerned about the implementation risk. History and lessons on these programs have taught us a lot about where they go wrong. And so, look, it's important for Commerce to own its role fully, right? Don't just check the box and get the rules out. They need to give rules that provide precise guidance, real specificity around the requirements that are in the statute. And I think they're going to have to keep a continuing oversight role if they hope to not be embarrassed that 3 or 4 years from now we look up and we spent a shocking amount of the taxpayers' money and we didn't get the results that we promised them. I think that risk is high, and we've seen it in past programs. And I think the happy talk period needs to be put behind us, and we now need to focus on getting this right, which is going to take the collective effort of everyone involved, because we all should want the right thing. We do not want to wake up in 4 years and say 10% of the money got stolen or wasted or went to objectives or programs that didn't bend the curve on the problem. So that's where we're focused. That's my concern. And I think we really do have an amazing job ahead of us.
Thanks, Michael. And I did see Chris Lewis nodding his head while you were talking to some of that. I think
we ball guys do that. It's a thing we do to signal.
Right.
You don't need to know about it.
Do you mean we all have to nod our
Handshakes.
heads?
Yeah.
Or no, we all. Next, John.
Yeah, I think
please.
Michael is absolutely right that this is going to be a 9-bank billiard shot with one stroke of the cue. We have to get it right. And in order to get it right, and in order to mitigate risks and to analyze appropriately the risks that we need to with cold and sober view, we need 3 things, I think. One is exquisite coordination, and I use the word exquisite in the medical sense, which is the highest form of pain. We have to painfully coordinate. In other words, give it our utmost attention between agencies. I'm actually a bit optimistic because I have seen the NTIA and Treasury and the FCC really beginning to find new habits and protocols of cooperation and coordination, and that augurs well, I think, for the future. But there are enormous risks that we're going to be facing, which requires second, consistency. The FCC has been in the driver's seat for the establishment of broadband policies. It knows what it's doing. It's done it well, and I hope that it will be a standard by which agencies that now are newly enfranchised to take on the role that the FCC has typically been playing will look to those best practices as they move forward, particularly at NTIA. And the third is data. Let's be really clear here. We have yet to have the consistent national harmonized maps that are going to be needed to ensure that we will have the most efficient and highest and best uses of the dollars that are going to be moving through the states. There's a promissory note that we've gotten from the chairwoman that these will come in in the fall. I hope that's right. But we need to also be clear that we already are seeing, unfortunately, some clouds on the horizon. We see that the administration is, in fact, being at cross purposes in some ways in the execution of this great and, I would say, noble project of getting every American connected. What do I mean? Well, we have $62 billion in the pipeline in an agency that is charged with coordinating it, that has fortunately gotten a bump in its budget a 30% plus bump in its budget, but it is still only $60 million. It is imposing Buy America restrictions that are going to be very challenging for our companies, our providers, to pass the thresholds of the stated criteria for Buy America. In the statute, in the IIJA statute, there are specific statutory language which is going to be treating every dollar that's going out for broadband deployment as taxable income, much like existing USF dollars are treated. Well, effectively, that's going to mean that about 20% of the dollars that are going out the door are going to be clawed back. We have some significant work to do to align our objectives of getting America fully connected and using these dollars as effectively and optimizing them as best we can. But we still have to, get our machetes out and do a lot of swinging through the underbrush of I think, some unfortunate headwinds that are coming our way. Not to mention preferences that have been given in both the Treasury's and NTIA's guardrails to municipalities and not-for-profit organizations. Let's get this right. Let's do some very, very clear-eyed risk analysis and mitigate these risks as quickly as we possibly can.
Well, Jonathan, how concerned are you about those preferences that seem to be given to municipal systems and governments? I don't want to be coy about it. At the Free State Foundation, for years, we've chronicled some of the difficulties that those municipal systems have had, and there has been pushback from Congress to preferencing those systems over private systems. But where does that stand now, as you understand it, and how concerned are you about it? And I'll let anyone else
I think
respond
our preference, thank you for that question, Randy. I think our preference above all must be to the efficient allocation of dollars to make sure that we can connect all Americans as quickly as possible with the resources that can be brought to bear by those providers that are best capable of the financial wherewithal, the operational excellence, and the capacity to actually get the job done. In some cases, that may be municipalities and not-for-profits. However, giving a blanket preference or even a priority, as the Department of Agriculture has done, to municipalities and not-for-profits who have shown that at any scale of broadband deployment have run into significant consistency issues and effectiveness issues in that project, to me makes absolutely zero sense. What we should be moving towards is not creating preferences, but partnerships. There are a number of broadband providers, many of whom we represent on this dais, who are willing and able to partner with any municipality, any not-for-profit, to get the work of connecting, the hard work of connecting communities, particularly rural communities, to broadband done right. And we should be prioritizing and preferencing excellence, not categorical, not categories of participants based on, I think, not very solid logic.
Okay. Jonathan, you mentioned the word maps when you were initially talking, and I was wondering when someone was going to mention maps, because we hear a lot about the maps and how that relates to doing the doling out of the funds properly. And I think you may have referred to this, but if not, Chairwoman Rosenworcel recently promised that the updated broadband maps, I quote, absolutely, close quote, will be finalized in the fall of 2022. And Alan Davidson, NCTA administrator, said the new maps are a, quote, gating item, close quote, with regard to the disbursement of the BEAD funds. Those are the funds being dispersed by NCTA. So we're going to wrap up this first segment on money that's being dispersed, but I want to give you, maybe people in our audience or C-SPAN audience may not understand the importance of maps when we're talking about what we're trying to accomplish here. And also, you've mentioned other items, so I'm going to give anyone here a chance, and maybe someone will talk about the maps, so we make sure on the record that that's clear why they're important. Or
Look, I would say quickly, look, the statute itself requires the maps as a predicate to distributing funds, so they're legally required in order to open the spigot. But they've been identified long before this legislation as essential to attacking this problem, because you got to know where the problem is. You have to have some kind of authentic, authoritative consensus of where the problem is in order to invest efficiently. The problem is, first of all, there are multiple maps. And this worries me, because the maps really, in a perfect world, would be integrated. So I think the chairwoman's talking about a set of maps of unserved areas, but not the set of maps that include funding that's already been distributed under RDOF and other programs, which isn't due out till 2023. So basically, you have one sovereign distributing monies from different pocketbooks to potentially the same areas if they're not coordinating those in the mapping exercise. So
right.
If you get a set of maps that are only about this effort, but yet next year you get a set of maps about existing programs, and you could have areas where there are full commitments by providers who receive funds to serve those areas, and all of a sudden you got a state who views the same area as unserved using FCC maps. The other question is, are the FCC maps preemptive? Are they the law of the land, or if California decides they don't like what the maps say, they're going to use some Californian map? That's not completely clear. We have a view about that, but that's going to be a big problem too. And the last thing I would say is map is data, and people will fight over it forever. I mean, we keep acting like the maps, and I hope they are as effective as we hope they will be, but I guarantee you people will weigh whether they are pointing money in the places they want or not, and there's going to be a lot of arguing and appealing and challenging about the specifics of the map. So it's necessary, it's essential, but it'll also be messier than I think some of the hope for thinking is. But we'll work through it. If I could just say one thing and then leave this topic, Jonathan was talking about preferences. I just want to emphasize one thing. These builds would be really complicated in normal times. But look at what an ISP has to do. It has to manage this federal program, number one, apply for, receive, and manage the resources. It has to do that in a 40-year inflationary environment, unprecedented in the modern era for building and construction. It has to manage one of the worst supply chain breaks in the modern history of the United States. It has to manage one of the worst labor shortages for the crews and constructions for building these projects, who will also be competing for other projects that are also being stimulated, everything from roads to bridges to whatever. We're also dealing with a serious backlog on silicon and chips that are necessary for the equipment to deploy this. So look, not that that's job impossible, but that's job really, really, really hard. And before you start giving out preferences or favoring different people, largely for political reasons rather than economic or effectiveness reasons, you better understand you're making a trade-off that you could later regret, because the management of this from a construction standpoint is going to require very seasoned executives, deep pockets, lots of experience, and the ability to scale and manage through what is really a once-in-a-century set of economic factors.
Okay, before we leave the topic, Chris or Meredith want to add anything? I see
Yes.
Chris does.
I'll try to be quick. I agree with the importance of the maps. I'm interested in policymakers and all of us having a deeper conversation about what else needs to be added to the maps. Congress passed a mapping law a couple of years ago. We were glad they did, because the maps were insufficient. They weren't accurately reflecting the business decisions by companies as to where they deploy or how much of a community they deploy to, which was often for real financial business reasons, but still people were being left out. So we need to see it on the maps, and we weren't. in the way that the FCC was tracking it. You know, I'm open to the idea of let's, you know, of what the chairman put out there about, you know, the efficiency of the projects. We also need to see pricing information because in some areas, especially in rural areas, people are paying the same prices for folks that in urban areas or more densely populated areas are paying for broadband for lower quality services. It's also happening in urban to urban communities. So this sort of information is important for the oversight that the chairman's talking about on all fronts, including the consumer protection oversight front. And I think it'd be a great conversation to talk about all the data that needs to be included in the maps. The last thing I'll say is, well, I may be the only one up here, I'm not sure, I may be the only one up here who likes municipal broadband projects. And they're, you know, some of the early ones who struggled. We should note the benefits of including them and why they were included in this bill. One, they can open up great competition. City of Alexandria, inside the Beltway, urban area where I live, we have one choice for high-speed broadband. It's Comcast. I give them my money every month. Pretty good service. However, if I wanted to switch, if I don't like their customer service, or for some other reason, the fact that the City of Alexandria is investing in a municipal project to build out fiber backbone and conduit and then lease that out to companies to lower their costs, to bring competition to our marketplace, I think that's a good thing. And so there's different types of municipal projects. They can be done poorly, they can be done well. We need to learn from the ones that are done well. And if we're investing with them with these dollars to make it easier to bring competition to a community, I'm all for that.
Okay, Meredith, you want to add anything on this topic?
Michael always says everything's so great. It's great to sit on a panel with him. You can just say, but just illustrative of how messy it is the wireless maps. I mean, kudos to the FCC. The wireless maps were done last August. So, you know, but they are separate. And, you know, kind of also illustrative, or what's behind the maps and what are the numbers. I will be very proud to tell you that 99.9% of the population has access to 4G. I've spent a lot of time with Senator Tester and his tractor on the corner of his farm, and that's not where a person lives, and he doesn't have 4G coverage right there. So, you know, the numbers are important, but sometimes they don't tell the whole story.
Okay, well, I have an idea that maybe we can do a Free State Foundation program on maps. Title it Maps, and we'll see how many people come. Okay, now we're going to now move for just a couple of minutes to the question of non-monetary impediments to increase broadband adoption. You know, we've talked about all the money, but if there are things in the way of getting broadband accomplished, the deployment accomplished that are impediments, we should take note of those. And now as we move through the next topics, we're going to move a little bit quicker. And so I'm also going to throw in I'm going to just put these questions on the table. The last FCC administration did do some things, whether one agrees or not, that were designed to remove some of the impediments to broadband deployment, you know, particularly at the state, local level, right? And some of that involved preemption. But those are some of the types of things I have in mind. So I'm going to ask whether there are still remaining impediments that to getting the broadband deployed that we ought to be aware of. And as part of that, I'm going to mention pole attachments, because I know the FCC has a proceeding on pole attachments. That's another one of those sexy topics. Maybe we'll do a program, maps and pole attachments, and get an even larger crowd. But the poles, of course, are relevant to getting broadband out across the country, and especially in rural areas. So with that backdrop, we're going to let you have a shot at talking about any impediments that stand in the way other than the money. Maybe this time, since I'm going to start with you on spectrum, I think I'll start down with Jonathan. We'll just go right down the line, perhaps a little more quickly.
Sure, and thank you, because I do think that the non-monetary barriers to deployment are legion and have to be addressed as quickly as we possibly can. Good news is that there is current legislation. The Kelly Danes Rural Broadband Development Act is still moving its way forward to actually lower barriers for deployment. Deemed granted, stop clocks, that's very important. But we still have to navigate the maze of barriers to deployment, including, as you said, in terms of poles. Our companies at USTelecom are not only pole owners, we own many, many poles, but we also, in many cases, are pole attachers. We've seen the waterfront of the challenges with getting a protocol for pole policy right. We commend the FCC for the work it's done for having a consistent approach to poles for many, many years, updated, I think, through rigorous regulatory reforms in both 2011 and 2018. But we still are at a moment, though, where this current proceeding is evaluating whether the costs to for pole replacements should be carried by those who actually have been fully deploying those poles and bearing the costs for the same. It's only in rare instances where poles are fully attached. We believe that the cost causer principle, a principle that I'm glad that NCTA for some time ago has been in alignment with us on, should continue to be consistent. It does not make any sense at all that in a competitive landscape, post-RDOF particularly, that new entrants who are seeking to actually deploy to rural communities would ask those who have been doing that work consistently and have borne the costs of putting up poles somehow have to share or carry those costs. In other words, to subsidize their OpEx for new pole replacements. I got to say that we don't think that that's a smart way forward. We don't think that it will remain a barrier to deployment that merely shifts costs from pole owners to cost causers. And I don't think that we should actually proceed down that lane if we actually want to achieve our overall goal of quick deployment to as many rural communities as we possibly can.
We're going to proceed down this lane right now because we've got to move. Michael, why don't you take up the
on
non-monetary?
one level, there's macroeconomic impediments, which I discussed: labor, supply shortage, silicon, fiber. These are things the government can potentially invest in helping. Secretary Raimondo has talked about this recently in her testimony. There's parallel microeconomic challenges, which you don't need to go into specifically. And then there's regulatory barriers and challenges like construction permitting, zoning, rights of way. We are already seeing significantly increasing time lags in the construction permitting process. We have companies ready to go that it takes them 24 months to get the permit. And that line is growing. And remember, the government is going to stimulate a dramatically higher number of people applying to these same small state offices for these permits, and those lines are going to get longer. That's going to be a serious impediment, right? I don't fully agree with Jonathan on poles, but we won't get into the internecine details of pole replacement costs and who's bearing that could be fun. We'll put that on the mapping conference.
And we'll both come to that.
We'll both debate about it, but I will say I could take issue with some of that. But here's the one thing I will say about poles. Poles is rural America. You can pretend there's some other way. There's no other way. But if you study the economics of cost per mile of deploying in these regions, and you want a body of new entrants or existing incumbents to go apply for these loans and go into these spaces, you've got to get them on poles. And you have to get them on poles at reasonable economic terms, or they will not do it. They will not take the money. They will not be harnessed for your goal. And so, look, a pole owner has a legitimate property interest in the pole. They also have gatekeeping bottleneck power over the cost and pricing of that pole that have to be sensitively observed and corrected for in some instances. And that doesn't mean all of them, it doesn't mean they don't deserve fair returns, but just do understand, we're watching poll rates go up, because if you saw the government was going to spend $45 billion and stimulate 75% of the build costs for new entrants, and you're sitting on a pole, what would you do?
Okay.
Right, the prices would go up.
Real
Chris,
quick,
yeah.
I'm
you
not going
go,
to get between these guys on polls, but what I will just say about what we saw in the last 3 or 4 years in the conversation around local permitting, we need to be really careful about really understanding the dynamics that are happening at the local level. I understand the urgency of companies wanting to get their deployment out and get through the permitting process as soon as possible. Folks who want broadband want that too. However, having worked in local government revenue is getting gutted right now. People are
Yes.
getting hit, and that means staffing levels in government are getting squeezed. And so there's got to be a level of the cooperation we talked about in finding solutions. There's got to be a level of cooperation of understanding that as they try to meet the companies who are waiting in line. There's got to be, I know people don't want to have extra fees put on them at the local level. We've got to find a way to support that process moving forward. It can't just be do better, move faster local government.
And one thing I want to add to your great point, then we have to be realistic about our political expectations at the federal level. We have a lot of members of Congress who think this is all going to take place and be done in 4 years. And I think there's a lack of realism in the expectations in the political environment, and that can lead to a lot of bad responses when this process goes slower. But this is a legitimate issue.
Can I just
Meredith?
add that,
Sure.
can I just add that I do think, not to be poly-positive, but I am. The thing is the FCC got the rules right for infrastructure for wireless, and we've seen more deployment. We have seen 67,000 new sites in the last 2 years, and that is more than in the last 7 years. So I think when you get the rules right, 32 states as well as Puerto Rico also enacted small cell site legislation. When you get it right, the companies are adding the dollars to make this roll out, and we all want broadband to roll out fast, so
Correct.
let's make sure we get it right.
Okay, now we're going to move to another topic, but it's in truth related, I think, to the first topic. So I think we can do it fairly quickly, but it's universal service reform. The FCC has initiated a proceeding at the direction of Congress that's going to lead to a report. And if I can put it in a nutshell, even though there are 893 questions, it's what to do about the universal service system. And this is, of course, the regime that provides subsidies for both supporting low-income people as well as healthcare facilities, educational facilities, and I think importantly, deployment. So what I want to do is just ask each of you, and again, as we go further along, I may even be less and less polite. We're going to try and do this fairly quickly. Having in mind all the money that we talked about earlier, can you give us your thoughts, if you have any, about what should be done about universal service? And of course, that includes the contribution aspect of it as well. I think this time, go ahead. I saw Chris move his hand. I'll start with Chris, and then we'll give everyone else a chance.
Maybe controversial in this room. Number one, give the FCC authority over broadband. If you want it to run a program that runs subsidies to broadband, maybe they should have authority over it so they don't get sued when someone doesn't like how they're running the USF program. Number one. There's different ways to get there. Number two, I think the coordination point about all the money that being doled out around broadband and not being coordinated by the expert agency on communications networks is a really important one. So that needs to happen. And then you can create a vision for where the universal service program goes in the future on these gaps that it was intended to deal with around how broadband isn't getting deployed, whether it's affordability, whether it's the priorities of education and healthcare, whether it's on deployment to rural areas where there's no business case. We have to deal with the contribution reform part. I get worried when people want to loop in randomly other industries into that revenue model that don't even have oversight at the FCC, and all of a sudden you're going to pull them in like big tech platforms because they're rich and because they're bringing in a lot of money right now. So there's a lot of ways to do the revenue part. Congress should look at the different ways to get there. But I think the simplest is to take the model that we've been using right now and expand it to all broadband providers rather than just telecom providers, because that's disproportionately hitting the folks who are still on telecom services, low-income, elderly people.
Okay, Michael, then Jonathan. Do you want to say anything?
I love
Michael?
when you hear the left say, "Don't tax them just because they're rich." That's a great. I think the more important thing is the intersection between what Congress did in providing for the first time direct appropriations to assist with adoption and affordability and its interplay with the Universal Service Program. I think that's the most important question. Because if this is the beginning of an entitlement program, I mean, I know that has a negative term, but I actually am in favor of it. I think if that's the beginning of a sort of philosophical or program change in how we might deal with that issue, I think that the interplay of that and the existing USF program, which is really a vestige of ancient monopoly telephone regulation and is littered with complexity and incongruity and struggles to keep pace with its obligations, the FCC would be most helpful as a thought leader in helping Congress understand that trade-off and intersect it. The other thing I would say is, look, the base, if you're going to do it the way you're doing it, a wider base at a thinner level is very efficient. And if you're going to talk about tech, it's not because they're rich, it's because they are massive users and have a direct economic benefit in the expansion of the network, the same way that the ISPs do, right? So if you're going to look at expanding to broadband revenues, then I don't know why it would be per se off the table to examine the entire internet ecosystem that benefits and profits from that same subsidized infrastructure.
John, and then we'll go to Meredith.
Thanks, Randy. And let me just also address your worry, Chris, about contributions reform in particular. Look, this is an existential issue. There is a fierce urgency of now, notwithstanding the fact that there's this great Infrastructure Act that has $62 billion, $65 billion poised to actually help connect Americans. That is not a one-and-done solution. Our collective members have been investing to the tune of $80 billion annually in infrastructure. It needs to be sustained, and USF is a critical adjacent source of revenue to make that happen. However, it is on course for a train wreck. We know that. And we need to understand as well that there are some very, I think, thoughtful ideas that are being considered to extend the contribution base to include bias services. Some have been arguing for extending it to other participants in the digital ecosystem. And I think that those need to be thought through very carefully and with, I think, an open eye. As Michael said, tech platforms are, in fact, indispensably reliant on broadband services. Oftentimes are standing up their own communications point-to-point services. There is, I think, legitimate discussion about whether 254 actually does confer to the FCC some latitude in extending the contribution base to them. These are issues that need to be both statutorily considered, but also we need to have, as Europe is having, a broader discussion about the proper role of extending both accountability and responsibility for universal service to a more diverse and broader economic base of internet participants.
When John, for a C-SPAN audience and others here, when John refers to bias services, he's not, in this context, talking about prejudice services, I think.
Well said.
But that's another way of referring to the broadband providers. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith, and then after you address this topic, if you'd like, then I'm going to turn to Spectrum, to you first. Go ahead.
Great. I'll be quick. What Michael said. Just kidding. I mean, yes, absolutely what Michael said. But additionally, I think during COVID, Congress and IIJA, Congress funded it, and I think it's a national priority. They should. If they don't, I think it's a fair question to ask who should pay for it and whose customers should pay for it. And I think wireless pays more than their fair share right now, so I'm glad for people to look at that question.
Okay, the point that spectrum is an important part of the solution, but the infrastructure, right? I guess infrastructure is appropriate in some sense to broadband deployment has already been made. Now we're going to focus a little more on spectrum issues, and I'm going to, Meredith, as I said earlier, of course, is president of the Wireless Association, so she gets to go first. And I just want to throw out, as I did before, just a couple things, and you can then address those or whatever else you want to. One would be, talk about what's in the pipeline and, the urgency or non-urgency of getting more spectrum available. Talk about the issues we've had with the coordination between the executive branch and FCC, because that's, been an issue that now a good part of some part of the American public has become familiar with, and that's relevant. So maybe with those prompts, why don't you take a couple of minutes to talk about spectrum, and then we'll just see whether anyone else has any other views.
So guys, he's talking about the FAA for the most part, but let me start first by pulling us back and say that I am blown away by the progress that we have made in the past 3 years. And both parties have lived this, they've done it together, and it's been incredible. We had CBRS, C-band, 3.45, and we're just about to start with the 2.5 auction. So that is really terrific. And when you hear me talk about 5G home, well, we can do that because of all this mid-band spectrum that's in the market. And when you hear about 5G around the world, you know what? That's mid-band spectrum. So it's really, really, really important, and I think we ought to take a second to celebrate the people who've made this happen at the FCC and on Congress and around this room. So thank you. And what Randy kind of vaguely mentioned or didn't mention, what I was talking about was making sure that what happened with the FAA in December never happens again. And to be honest, we're in a much better place than we were in December, and the parties are really talking and they're making really good progress. We're way better than we were. We still have a ways to go, but we're way better. And I give everyone credit for that. But to me, it's really how do we avoid this happening again? And the answer to that is NCTA and the FCC, and I would give a great kudos to Jessica and Alan because they are the right leaders at the right time. I think that we, as well as Congress and the White House, really need to make sure that they are empowered to be the final voice on spectrum. And I mean that. When I was in both places, that was the way it was, and we need to get back to that now.
Okay, on spectrum, any quick points by any of the other panelists? It's an important topic. Hey, one thing I'll just say right now, I'm going to get these. You see how important and topical this discussion is to really our country. I'm going to get these guys to come back, we'll say, in at least 4 or 5 months, and we're just going to continue the discussion.
Okay.
That's what I'm going to do. But in the meantime, go ahead.
Can I just agree the point about the government? The public doesn't care as long as the government gets it right, and it's confusing when an agency like the FAA after years of studies at the expert agency, the FCC somehow says that a spectrum band that's being deployed for wireless is suddenly not going to work. And especially when it was working in where it's already been deployed in Europe. This is if folks who don't follow this every day like we do, heard scare tactics about planes falling out of the sky in December, that simply just were not matching the science at the FCC. This is when people get disappointed in their government because it's not being efficient. They're getting different messages from different agencies. So she's right. The NTIA and the FCC need to be the last word. We have the right leadership there to make it happen. I agree with everything she said, but folks I worry about folks who weren't following this and all of a sudden got scared. That is just Washington not doing its job.
Okay, and I know spectrum is not unimportant to cable and to John's situation too. So do you want to add anything?
First of all, I have to say I agree with everything Meredith said. No spectrum conversation is complete without an emphasis on unlicensed spectrum too, which is an essential set of services for the American consumer. And I think to the American consumer, a broadband experience is primarily a Wi-Fi unlicensed experience, and those services are evolving dramatically as well, gig Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi 7. So we also commend the Commission around more unlicensed spectrum around 5.9 and 6. And so we're excited to continue to look for well-coordinated opportunities to improve spectrum available for that innovation as well.
And though we are known as a wired infrastructure association, it is important to note that many of our members are acquirers of spectrum in the 12 gigahertz band, from SpaceX to AT&T. Fixed wireless deployment is a common tool that is being deployed by not only our larger companies, but by our smaller entities, which is why one of the reasons that we've been very clear that when it comes to not just spectrum policy management, the FCC should be at the epicenter of that policy making, but also that the auction processes that have been developed at the FCC and managed by the FCC need to be the predominant mode by which we're actually distributing spectrum most efficiently. The conversations that had existed are still going on about whether there should be some wholesale model managed potentially by an agency like the DoD. And when we get into the thick of 6G conversations and who should be managing spectrum assets as we evolve towards next and newer generations, we have to keep in mind that the FCC must be in the pole position.
So Randy, if you don't mind, he talked about what's next, and I think if this is the only spectrum question, I need to tag on to this about what is next in auction authority.
Go right ahead.
Okay, so if you go back and look at how we got all of the spectrum that we use right now, it was Congress. So Congress is sneaky driving spectrum policy, and that's a good thing. And they do it best when they give the FCC auction authority. And we're quickly running up to this date, September 30th, when they run out of auction authority. And so I guess if the last time they did it in 2012, we got the 600 megahertz band, we got AWS3, and we got the H block, okay? All what we're using now, and it's super, super critical. But if we look at our very successful mid-band push, we're at the end of it. The 2.5 auction is the last of that. And so Congress needs to reauthorize and look at the empty cupboard. The best thing that happens is when Congress attaches not only the spectrum authority to the FCC, but the bands for the pipeline for the next years. So we are entirely in favor of, I've got my list of bands, and I think it is the right bands both globally and as far as government use goes. But we need to be going through that list to make sure that when Congress authorizes spectrum authority, it attaches these very important bands to make sure it happens, that it's there in statute. And the other good thing that can happen with that is that they can designate where the funding goes. So that's how we got FirstNet, because it was attached to AWS3. And I know that we have some very important priorities from Congress, and we know that Chairman Chairwoman Rosenworcel really wants the funding for NG 911, which I think is a priority we all share. And so I think it's really important that not only do we reauthorize the FCC's auction authority, but that we attach a designated pipeline with that.
30 seconds, Randy?
Just 10 seconds.
Oh, 10 seconds. These are the public's airwaves. It's why the FCC was entrusted with managing them. I completely agree with Chair Rosenworcel. NG 911 is a great priority. We get so much money out of this spectrum. There are other opportunities, including funding digital equity, which has largely been funded at the local level through partnerships by these industries. We can create a permanent fund using auction revenue. I think it's another goal, a public interest goal, to use public interest or public dollars from public airwaves on. Yeah.
Okay, well, you see why I got this group committed to do this again in a few months. I could do this like one of those debates where I say all those that are committed, raise your hand, but I'm not going to do that because we're going to do it. But here's what we're going to do as we begin to wrap up this. I had on my sheet here for myself, my prompt sheet, net neutrality. We've done it all before, and we'll do it again. But I think we're going to do it this way, really. Number one, I'm going to use that as an opportunity just to plug our book, Free State Foundation book, A Reader on Net Neutrality and Restoring Internet Freedom, which is a collection of a lot of essays by economists, lawyers, policymakers, others, concerning net neutrality regulation and what should be done. And I don't want to be coy about it. In our book, most all of these are explaining why imposing common carrier like Title II regulation on internet service providers from a legal and policy point would not be a good thing. But here, we're still where we have been for some time now with the Restoring Internet Freedom Order in place that the Ajit Pai administration put in place. So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to go down the line, and this time I really am going to be strict. If you would like to say why or why not, and give your brief reasons, the FCC should consider reimposing Title II regulation, common carrier regulation on ISPs, do it, or why they shouldn't do it. Jonathan.
To look back at the
short.
last 2
Short.
years, sure. To look back at the last 2 years of our experience with the internet, the unbelievable amount of streaming and healthcare and civic engagement, and conclude that somehow we have a net neutrality problem in the United States defies logic and reason. Ideological, yes. Common sense, no. Fact-based, certainly not. If we could expend some of the energy that we're giving to this rinse and repeat cycle of considering the Title I, Title II consideration, and draw that and the fund and to the more fundamental issue of getting deployed broadband to every American that needs it, I think that would be a much better use of our time and resources than rehearsing old and stale debates of resurrecting dead and gone net neutrality provisions that are rooted in a 1934 law.
Okay, Michael, you were the author of the great broadband digital migration speech that I referred to earlier back in 2000, which to me really sounds relevant still to this question. Go ahead.
Look, back then, my faith and my purpose were to try to acclimate and create a climate in the markets where they would naturally provide a free and open internet, and I think that was successful. I think the government has a hard time demonstrating on any measure of reasonableness how they're going to make the internet world better for consumers and providers by virtue of these rules. We haven't had rules since 2015. There is no pattern in practice of the supposed negative behavior that we're apparently chomping at the bit to engage in. Quite the opposite has happened, contrary to predictions. Our network speeds have increased 800%. Our prices are one of the lowest lagging consumer inflation in the country, only at around 2.5 to 2.8% of the CPI, which is moving at 8.5%. You've had 5G networks invested in the interim. You've had 10G in the cable industry. You've had fiber builds. And the country's moved on. The two most central focuses of broadband policy today is the infrastructure mission, which is job one, and I think the complexity of issues that rise from big tech. I find this issue to be painfully distracting from the issues that matter. It will absorb an enormous amount of time, effort, and labor and conflict, and it'll make, no matter what the rules say, it'll make very little difference to the consumer internet experience that consumers are getting today. And the consequences, and it's even more disheartening because the rules are always born with a fatal flaw. And that flaw is they're easy to change and they'll change in the next administration. When will we stop the madness? It doesn't even matter what the rules say. You could be 2 years from them just being eliminated again by the next administration. If someone were genuinely committed to ending the merry-go-round, it could be done. It could be done easily. I hope and urge the FCC to do it, but I doubt it because it's become a form of political virtue signaling, not policy making.
Okay. Chris.
I'm not sure where to start.
But,
Let me start with the fact that net neutrality protections are needed because the harms that we're concerned about are real, and that's why just about every company that is a member of these trade associations, when asked about the actual protections, supports them. So no blocking, no throttling. Jonathan's nodding because he agrees with no blocking and no throttling. No paid prioritization. I don't know if they agree with that or not, but I think there's a real important case for it because as the DOJ said many years ago, broadband providers sit at a place in the marketplace where they have the ability and the financial incentive to preference themselves or preference others. These are basic rules of the road. And if we can agree on the rules of the road, if the companies agree that those rules of the road it's really about how do you implement them. And that's what the debate's about. That's why you hear about Title II. I would love it if the Congress was serious, Chairman, about creating legislation to end the merry-go-round, as you called it, but they haven't seemed serious. We hear about task force being created in the Senate to create a net neutrality law. This task force aren't meeting with anyone. They haven't met with us. And we've told them we're ready to come and meet with them. So this is why the public interest community, the folks advocating for net neutrality, go to the FCC every chance we get and say we need to create rules. This is why we advocated for the rules, the strong ones out of California that got upheld in the court 4 times now. And hopefully this is why we haven't seen egregious net neutrality violations by companies since the 2015 rules were repealed because there's a law in California, because they know that we're going to take the list in front of policymakers and show them that these violations are real, but they are real and they aren't getting investigated, whether you're talking about AT&T preferencing their own video services. When data caps are applied, Comcast doing the same thing. The incident with the fires, emergency communications getting throttled in California during wildfires.
Chris.
These need to be looked at by an agency with authority. Thank you, Randy.
Now, you were saying this is why, and this is why I invited you here, as I said at the beginning.
I appreciate
it. But we're going to do it again, and we'll have time to have a full discussion on net neutrality. That was just a preview to try and sell a few books right here. And Meredith, unless you want to say anything that Michael and...
I think I'd rather talk about polls.
Polls, yes.
No, I echo what those two said. Sorry. Okay. But I think we need one rule. It needs to come through Congress. I think consumers are benefiting from an open internet. And I don't think what consumers want has really changed. And I think we're giving them that. I also think the only thing that really probably has changed is in 2022, it probably shouldn't be ISP specific, only ISPs.
And by the way, if you're talking about digital platforms, we also advocate for a digital regular agency to deal with non-discrimination issues at that level, but they're in a different business than you guys.
boy, I really can see the makings of course, a separate program on net neutrality. Personally, I don't think it necessarily would be as exciting as the MAPS pole attachment program, but you never know. So I want you to hold your applause for just a minute. We're going to have Russ Hanser from NCTA come up, and he's going to be introduced by Brian Tremont from the Wilkinson Barker firm. I'm going to remind you again, when we finish this session, there's going to be a terrific buffet behind that panel over there. So stay for that. And then right after that, we've got the panel with the FTC commissioners, and they're going to be talking about a lot of hot topics that are going on in the competition area and over at the FTC. So with that, I just think this has been terrific. That's the type of dialogue that I had hoped we would have and felt confident that we would have. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Randy.